Right, well, thank you for coming to our latest panel discussion at the Working Class Climate Alliance. So this is the start of our global series about the rise of the far right, where we're going to explore its relationship to climate change and other forms of inequalities through both in-person and remote events, starting from now going into next year and probably 2026 as well. So for us, our question really is, nationalist and authoritarian forces erode our democratic values, social cohesion and ability to prevent the climate crisis from escalating even further. And although efforts to counter the rise of the far right are not new, their prominent visibility in our media, politics and streets has reached unprecedented levels in recent years. And for us, we kind of sit, and think, how has this happened and what can we do to stop it? So today we've invited four great speakers who will be talking for about 10 minutes individually, and then there'll be time for Q&A at the end. If you guys could write your questions in the chat and I'll read them out sort of for you rather than coming off mute. So introducing people in order of appearance. We have Thanos, who's an immigrant to Scotland from Greece. He's a social care professional with a BA in sociology and an MED in adult education, community development and youth work. And we have Stevie, who's a trade unionist and co-director of Trademark Belfast. We have Sasha, who's director of Organising for the European Community Organising Network, and she's our political strategist and organiser as well. And we have Cian from Rise, who's a chief editor of Rupture magazine and producer for Rupture Radio. So I'll let you take it away, Thanos.
I am. Can you all hear me okay? So I'm going to speak briefly, maybe less than 10 minutes, about the experience of the Greek anti-fascist movement and how it dealt with the neo-Nazi party Golden Dawn, which at some point was the largest and the strongest neo-Nazi party in Europe. I think there are some probably useful lessons to take from the experience of the Greek anti-fascist movement and apply them in the UK, but generally speaking, worldwide. So the first point is that the Golden Dawn Party capitalized on Greece's economic collapse and refugee crisis, and used these two to build fear amongst working class communities by blaming immigrants and leftists, and in turn use that fear to enhance its own political power. Now, there is a similar situation at the moment in the UK, where far-right politicians from Reform or the Conservative Party and even the Labour Party are trying to do the same in different levels, obviously. But the main point is that the Greek anti-fascist movement, which is largely deeply rooted in working class communities, kind of put a stop to that by being constantly present within their own community. So if there was a family, for example, that they were going hungry, there were already in place self-organized solidarity networks that would provide food. If there was a need for medication or to be seen by a GP, there were already self-organized pharmacies or self-organized GP practices. So when the far right when the Nazis tried to point at the immigrants and say, oh, immigrants are taking our place in hospitals, that wasn't the case. Like, everybody knew that there were no places in hospitals because there was an underfunding, but the working class had created its own solidarity structures. It is also worth noting that in cities, largely in Greece, 10% of the population is migrant. So the immigrants from all over the world are visible. It's not like 1-2% of the population. There are big migrant communities in Greece. Another point I would like to mention is that in Greece, the neo-Nazi party Golden Dawn was legitimized by the mainstream media. for a very long time, for over 15 years, they were even invited to TV panels to discuss their views. Just before the height of their violence, where they went out and killed migrants and killed Greek anti-fascists and they murdered people, you had TV shows making special reports, lifestyle reports on what music they like and if they have, girlfriends and stuff like that. To counteract that, the Greek anti-fascist movement created its own media, and they still are independent, and they managed through the use of social media to counter all the misinformation that was going through the mainstream media, not only about the neo-Nazi party, but also about, the demonization of immigrants and all the things that the far right is usually doing through the mainstream media. Another point I like to raise is that in Greece's case, police was the Golden Dawn's best friend. They have been caught on camera several times working together to assault left-wing protesters. There have been various cases where it has been recorded that the Greek police provided cover for the neo-Nazi party to launch attacks. There was a case, for example, in a fairly working-class neighborhood in Athens, where the police escorted neo-Nazi members of the Golden Dawn who attacked a social center where anarchists were giving English classes to working-class pupils. But this also started kind of raising questions among the Greek working class on what is the role of the neo-Nazis. Like, if you attack people who teach English to poor working class kids, then something's wrong with you. As I said before, yes, the solidarity networks that were in place kind of halted the advance of the Nazi party. Although they reached 7% in votes and they went to become a parliamentarian party, the fact that they tried to take over primarily working class neighborhoods and communities across the country did not work, because when they tried to occupy these spaces by providing solidarity just for Greeks, and try to exclude everyone else, it didn't work, because there were already so strong solidarity networks that the locals, white working class Greek locals, had already built relationships. So if you know that your neighbor who is a migrant goes to the same social kitchen or to the same social pharmacy, and you have developed bonds with each other, when the Nazi far-right thug comes, you're not gonna be like, oh yes, of course, I'm gonna choose you. So this provided a fairly good shield against the advancement of the Golden Dawn Party. A major difference I've noticed so far is that the Greek left in general is primarily based in the working class, where in the UK is primarily in the middle class. And when the Nazis tried to go into working class communities, the response from the left was the response from the working class. Unfortunately, that is not necessarily the case in the UK. Even in Scotland, where we do not have any issues with race riots, the majority of the people opposing the far right comes from the middle class, because the working class in the UK has been disenfranchised that much that they're no longer active politically. So if there was one thing to be raised, is that's where they maybe that's where there should be some focus in ensuring that the working class comes at the forefront politically. I don't know what else to add, because I think I've added my main points. So that would be me for now.
Thank you. That was great. Yeah, Stevie, take it away.
That was quick. All right, okay. I'll keep an eye on the time. I'll try and be disciplined. Thanks for the invitation to speak today, just so that people know who we are. Trademark is part of the Irish Congress of Trade Unions. We have a kind of distant relationship from them. We're officially part of the Irish labour movement, and our background is in dealing with the peace process in Ireland. Unfortunately, more recently, has meant dealing with the rise of fascism, the rise of the far right as well, in terms of our approach to our work, which is mainly in political education. The first thing to say, I suppose, is that the riots we saw recently didn't start in those communities. They started really in the British Parliament. They started in the editorial rooms of the mainstream press, and they've been supercharged, really, I suppose, by the rights manipulation of social media. When rioters are chanting "Stop the boats" and "We want our country back," they're kind of parroting what they hear elsewhere. The great irony is, of course, is that many of those same politicians who have been mainstreaming and normalizing racism and Islamophobia for, you could argue, forever, but certainly for the last 2 decades, then act shocked when fascists go around beating people up and burning down shops. And so it's not enough, is it, to call out violence? Those politicians and that establishment need to stop normalizing Islamophobia, normalizing racism. But of course they won't, because it suits them. And we see the same pattern across the globe. It's the oldest trick in the book: divide and conquer, punch down rather than look up. The resurgence of racism and far right populism, I mean, it's not the result of popular demands coming from working class people, but rather it's the kind of logical conclusion of the need, really, to push reactionary ideas into the mainstream that divert us away from the multiple crises that we face, economic, social, and of course environmental as well. And so mainstreaming and normalizing the far right does a number of things. One, of course, it strengthens and emboldens the systemic racism that already exists in society anyway. Secondly, it legitimizes far right ideas, and it legitimizes the far right as a genuine alternative. And that leaves the left, broadly speaking, in Europe, I'll speak just about Ireland, Britain, and Europe, it leaves us in a very precarious position, because then it seems that the only choice is between an increasingly resented status quo, rightly resented status quo, and the far right. And the far right becomes really a legitimate choice. And in that scenario, there doesn't seem to be a left alternative. And so, yeah, we become sidetracked by these forces of reaction, their culture war arguments, and that diverts attention away from what we should be talking about, which are radical political alternatives. Because it's impossible to explain the far right's re-emergence without reference to, obviously, the growing conditions of, economic insecurity and inequality and all those other things we know are results of 50 years of neoliberalism and 15 years of austerity. Ideas and social forces like the right don't emerge in a vacuum. Obviously, they're shaped by our material conditions. And I suppose approaching, as I know that everyone here does, approaching the challenges we face from that kind of materialist perspective gives us a bit of a vantage point than kind of wringing our hands or liberal guardian moralizing about the rise of bad people on our streets. And of course, the far right is on the march everywhere. Traditional conservative parties in Europe have shifted to the right. The cordon sanitaire, so-called, is gone. The far right's in coalition in Sweden, Finland, Netherlands. The far right is the government in Italy, third largest economy in Europe. Rassemblement National is not far away from taking power in France, I would argue. Even though they've tried to move away from their fascist origins for electoral purposes, they're still packed full of fascists and Nazis. We've got Vox in Spain, Chega in Portugal, a party that went from 4 to 21% in the space of a year. A party of Salazar supporters, a party of, what do they call themselves, God, Faith and Fatherland. Also a good reminder that Europe has no problem dealing with fascist regimes, by the way, as it did with Franco and Salazar for 50 years. Alternative for Deutschland in Germany, polling second place across the country, winning elections regionally in East Germany. And of course, you've got right-wing regimes like Hungary and Turkey that have moved even further to the right once they've gained power. Not to mention, of course, the genocidal onslaught of Israel and Palestine. And what that does as a kind of a bounce back and the impact that's having driving authoritarianism across Europe as liberal capitalist democracies kind of slide into ever increasing levels of authoritarianism to prevent people, imagine it, prevent people protesting fucking genocide. And that's where we are in 2024. Now, why it's happening is the question, and we all know why, really. It's not an exaggeration to say that neoliberalism and this particular version of capitalism is breaking down amidst the multiple crises it faces, including, of course, climate breakdown. But what it's doing is leading to a crisis of legitimacy, really, for the ruling order and of liberal capitalist democracies in particular. And that's fed the growth, really, of an anti-establishment, anti-politics, which the right has utilised to great effect. Naomi Klein said it recently. I'm not a big fan of hers, but she said something really good recently. She said, that the right get the facts wrong, but they get the emotions right. And I think that sums up a lot of what's happening at the moment. People are fucking angry. They're right to be angry, and the left isn't capitalizing on that. And so at the same time, of course, the ruling class, if you want to, that's what I call them. You can call them what you want, whatever makes you feel comfortable. The 1%, the oligarchs, the rich, the capitalist class are waking up to these crises. And as they do, one of the questions for us, I suppose, is to what extent they'll be aligning themselves with fascist parties to maintain power, to maintain their assault on working class communities, what kind of populist appeals they'll be making to win over sections of the working class and to recruit the working class. Because, and I know I didn't tell you this, but I'll say it anyway, I mean, you know, fascism is not a working class phenomenon, it's a ruling class project. But recruitment to fascism still relies on the weaknesses of working class self-organization and working class consciousness. And that's our challenge, because we've never been weaker, certainly not in a European context. And where the left is in all of this, I know the left is a broad umbrella. Let's talk about the electoral left in Europe. I know there are wins and losses in different places, but the overall trend is clear. One of the characteristics of neoliberalism has been that kind of the emergence of that new political consensus. There's no alternative to free market economy. There's no alternative to austerity. You've got the right saying, we're going to punch you in the face. And you've got social democratic and even in name socialist parties saying, yeah, we're going to punch you in the face too, but we're going to wear a glove when we do it. But you're still getting punched in the fucking face. And that's people's choice at the moment. And so all across Europe, socialist and social democratic parties, the traditional ones, if you like, have come to embrace their role really in kind of managing and defending the status quo at the expense of workers' interests and expense of community solidarity and community cohesion. And so people are turning elsewhere to look for answers. There was a report out recently, it was last year actually, called The Politics of Austerity. It wasn't a great report, but one of the findings was that it showed that it studied 200 elections across Europe, and it said that when centre-right parties impose austerity, it doesn't really have much impact on their electoral chances. But when social democratic and in name socialist parties implement austerity, two things happen. One, it leads to lower election turnout at the next election, because people think, why the fuck's the point in voting? You're two cheeks of the same ass. And the second thing it does is that people who do turn out to vote for far-right parties. So when left-wing governments in particular implement austerity, it directly benefits the growth of the far right. And that's what we're going to see, I think, in Britain anyway, over the next 5 years. That's going to be your experience, I'd imagine. The last point I'll make is the other aspect of the growth of the far right that, I mean, if we had this conversation 10 years ago, we wouldn't be talking about this next point, and that's how we understand the online war and digital organizing and the online world, because that's different than anything we've coped with before. And we've seen a kind of the emergence of a global online far right networks, new online subcultures, and you can almost understand the entire thing as like a malicious propaganda machine. That's kind of how it's working at the moment. It's a world that's increasingly well-funded, increasingly sophisticated, it's quite disciplined, and it's an effective process actually of radicalization. And it acts as a conveyor belt. You'll have all seen it in your own families. I've seen it in my family, the Andrew Tate effect, particularly amongst young men kind of being dragged down that rabbit hole as people who want to go to the gym and tidy their room at a Jordan Peterson, and then 6 months later they're a fucking fascist. But it acts as a conveyor belt, bringing those far-right narratives really out of the online world into workplaces, into our families and into our communities. And we may have to admit actually that far-right have won the online battle. Their digital propaganda has easily defeated our own, even if we had anything to claim that we do. I don't even think we have any digital propaganda of any worth. Now, of course, it's no surprise that these platforms are privately owned, by the way. Just like the mainstream media, you know, it's not a free press, is it, when it's owned by a couple of billionaires? That's a private press for private interests. It's no surprise that Bezos, who owns Amazon, bought the Wall Street Journal, and it shouldn't be any surprise that Musk, who owns Tesla, bought Twitter. Whether it's mainstream media or social media, private ownership of the means of production has always, in the history of capitalism, been matched by private ownership of the intellectual means of production. This is just a further development in that regard. The difference is it seems to be much more powerful. And trying to understand its power is one of the things we're at the moment. So I'll leave it there. To finish with the idea, I suppose the big picture here is that the far right has grown, I'd argue, or we'd argue, in the absence of a proper socialist alternative. And so obviously our job is to talk about and build those alternatives, because if we on the left fail to provide rational and progressive solutions to the growing social and economic crisis that we face, well, you know that the right's going to step in and provide and kind of seize the occasion really with irrational and reactionary solutions to those crises. And that seems to be where we are. So I'll leave that there. Cheers. Goramaigi. That was 10, wasn't it? Yeah, that wasn't too bad on the button.
No, it's better timing than I can normally manage. I normally get carried away and lose all sense of time. But Sasha, yeah, and thank you. Oh, you're on mute.
I did that really middle-aged thing of keeping myself on mute. Thanks, Emma. I could listen to Steve for much longer, and I do listen to Steve for much longer. I do a little name drop before I continue, but they do an amazing podcast series. So if you want to hear more of that, I really recommend it. And it's something that I use quite a lot in my organising training as well, just to make sure that we're weaving in political education into understanding what organising and community organising is, because we need that power analysis, and more importantly, we need that class analysis in the work that we do. So yeah, I'm the Director of Organising for the European Community Organisers Network. So to some extent, well, to quite a big extent, get an overview of the rise of the far right and the direct impact it has on communities on a really grassroots level. Much of my work up until this point has been around organising, which is kind of cool because I get to focus my efforts on that kind of building working class organising capacity, political education, really looking at working class environmental justice and policy solutions that are community led. And I get to travel across the world doing it, and meeting people who are doing this job. I mean, it's really cool. But I won't claim that I have some deep fucking vocation to do this work. That's like I wake up every morning with a fire in my stomach thinking, yeah, I'm going to go and be a community organizer. You know, I don't actually. It isn't. I started doing this because I was skint. I was working with my best mate. We were both on universal credit, doing various jobs like cleaning and that mostly. We're both single mothers with really little kids, and it turned out we shared the same politics. We both eventually got sucked into the whole like Corbyn project, which I won't get into now because it will end up quite a big major rant, which both Emma and Stevie have heard me bang on about before. But I will say that it kind of like at the moment gave us a chink in the armor of party politics, where we thought, rightly or wrongly, another rant, but I won't get into that, gave us as working class people access into the left of the Labour Party. But when we got into it, we looked around and like, it didn't, like for us, it didn't seem like, we felt like we were shouting into a void. Like, it didn't seem like we had a choice to be there. For us, it was life or death. Like, before I entered this kind of political space, I'd been called into the head teacher's office, and she sat me down and she said that the school dinner ladies were saving extra food for my kids because the packed lunches weren't enough and they were hungry. And there's like nothing more fucking horrific than a teacher telling you that your own children are hungry. And I know that, like, I had the political analysis to know that that is not my fault. But like, as a mum, you're going to feel hurt, and it was horrible. So like getting into politics, whether it was a Corbyn project or wherever it was, felt like life or death. And in this moment, me and my best friend, and we also like, we're both staunch trade unionists as well. We had a political analysis to draw from. We thought, yeah, you do whatever you can. And this isn't uncommon in working class communities. And there's a varying degree of political analysis in there, but you know, that kind of basis for community organizing is very kind of key to who we are in our communities. But this isn't the case for most people who end up working in parliamentary politics in Westminster, the ruling classes. And like many, many working class people in these spaces, we really did feel like, and I still continue to feel like, I'm shouting into the void. And it's exactly how I felt at the exit polls on election day this year. I was in a pub in Stroud, and while everyone cheered and spilled their pints clapping, I sat in horror. And I was sitting next to the Green candidate, who him and his team were on their feet clapping. And I was just like, wait a minute. Can anybody see what it felt like an episode of Black Mirror or something? It's like, this is a town that is the birthplace of XR, that considers itself very like climate-y. and Reform Party had done better than the Greens. And they, like, we didn't even know who the candidate was for this Reform Party. Like, I don't think anyone had ever met him before. Like, literally never seen his face. And they did better than the Greens. And it was a really fucking weird, like, Black Mirror episode, looking around at people shouting and being excited that we'd got the Tories out. It's like, don't you see what's going to happen here? This agenda that had been set by multiple racist governments, of course, over decades, you know, in fact, you could say even over centuries. But like in the immediate, like current moment, there was an agenda set at the election campaign that was so anti-migrant and racist. So when the race riots happened, it wasn't really a shock to most of us who are Black and brown and saw this coming. It was just like, oh yeah, this is what we've been warning about and been told that we were like, we should take a moment to just enjoy that we got the Tories out. And anyone who'd worked under a Starbuck government, which I had the small brief moment of having to work in until I was fired for being too left-wing, can tell you that like there was nothing worth celebrating anyway. But of course, we're seeing this playing out across Europe. A few groups that we work with organised around localised Green New Deal policies and just transition campaigns. We're just finding it increasingly harder and harder to do climate work. And these policies are basically not fit for purpose. And there's a growing Euroscepticism, of course. There's a whole like Brussels aren't here for us kind of attitude, and they're not wrong. And people are angry. And in this vacuum, there feels a far-right narrative capitalizing on this. And across Europe and the world, we see areas where nationalism and far-right governments, campaigns, agendas on the rise and filling these holes. And these movements have evolved to understand that the planet is in crisis. They're not deniers anymore. And they are scrambling to find causes and solutions that further their own agenda and build a stronger international far-right movement. And as Stevie has said, they've really got so much behind them, this kind of digital organizing, the online sphere that they absolutely dominate. Like a lot of the people, like, as I said, who voted for reform in our area, and I'm talking about kind of like rural town, you know, declining high street kind of area, are young men that my kids are interacting with, and they've come home and said, oh yeah, my mate so-and-so was talking about voting for reform. It's like, wow, it really is that either you got that kind of tidy your room, go to the gym, pipe to far right pipeline that Stevie was talking about, and you've also got this like wellness to far right pipeline to follow. There are so many. They have really marketed themselves incredibly well, and they've got the backing from the top. Like I was walking down, sorry, I know I'm going on a bit, but I'll stop in a minute. But I was walking down Stroud High Street, and there's a group called The Light. I don't know if anyone's heard of them. They sell a newspaper. They're a bunch of like Nazi apologists that sell this like far-right conspiracy newspaper, basically. And on their stall, they had a row of red T-shirts, shirts that were made by a local like anti-racist camp, like Stroud Against Racism or something, that said "Fascist Free Stroud" on them. And I was like, you literally are the fascists in Stroud. On the street representation of this like wellness to far right pipeline, but also this kind of weird mirror world that they're able to kind of like co-opt and take the things that sound, you know, reasonable and like nice and turn it into theirs. And untangling this mess is so hard. And all I can say is like, yeah, maybe I did dream of becoming a film star and making films and not necessarily of going into politics, but fuck, do we need as many working class organisers with a class analysis and like with a political education to back it up, because that is absolutely the work that needs to be done to counter what is going on right now. Yeah. that's all I got.
No, thank you. And I had a similar thing here as well, just to note, you know, when people were clapping like the Tories are out, and it was like, yeah, but now we got Tories with red ties. It doesn't make a difference, but thank you. Cian, you should be able to share your screen, I think.
Yeah, can everybody hear me? Good. Yeah, I'll share my screen in a second. Just a little bit first. So myself, Cian Prendiville, I'm the now outgoing chief editor. I'm no longer in that position from Rupture, which is a eco-socialist magazine here in Ireland. Yeah, I know I was asked to speak primarily about an article I wrote for our online website about reflecting on the elections that took place in the south in Ireland and the upcoming elections likely in the south and the danger of the far right there. So I'll go through that in a second, and then I added a couple of extra bits at the end to try to broaden it out, because it's a little bit electoral focused, and it's entirely focused on the south. But maybe you'll find that interesting, and then at the end I have a couple of more broader points. But I'm going to try to share that now if I can figure out what I'm doing. Does that work? You see, that's the title. Hopefully that's working. That's the title of the article, the case for left unity in the coming general election, that I wrote a couple of weeks back now at this stage. But just to go through before we get into that. So, like, I think the situation that we're in the south is in Ireland is kind of somewhat familiar to you, I'd say, but much earlier stages. The rise of the far right is at a much earlier stage here. The defeats and the setbacks by the left are at a less level than they were in Britain or across Europe. It's kind of we're coming into line with the norm across the Anglosphere and across the Europe, but we are still not quite as extreme. Not quite as an extreme, I think, in terms of demoralization on the left, and not quite as an extreme in terms of gains from the far right, but that is unfortunately the direction of travel, I would say. So the background is that I've just carved it up there, this isn't rigid, but I would assess the general political periods in Ireland in the last 15 years as being that from 2011 to 2018 you had a real progressive outpouring of struggle on the back of the austerity and the bailouts and all of that sort of stuff. We had major public sector strikes. We had talk of a general strike. And we had major trade union or cross union protests against austerity. We also had community-led campaigns, like I was involved in the campaign against the household tax that sort of resisted one of these austerity charges that was being imposed. And then the single biggest thing in 2014 that broke through was the anti-water charge movement. That's me burning an Irish water bill in Limerick. We had massive protests in Limerick, and like 10,000 people, the biggest city's ever seen. But that was replicated right across the country, hundreds of thousands on the streets. It peaked at 2/3 of people boycotting the bills and forcing the abolition of that. And you also then, some of that momentum also carried through with the marriage equality victory that was won in that same period, and the repeal of the eighth, which was the winning of abortion rights in 2018. And so you had a period of like a march forward by the left. Everything felt good. I find myself, most new leftists that I'm talking to now that are a bit demoralized, I find myself trying to remind them that things weren't always this bad. I swear, like at this stage, you had community Facebook groups were coming together to block water meters, to organize protests against austerity, doing all of the kind of annoying things that the far right are now able to do very successfully, but originally the left was able to do them when the wind was with us, you know. Then I think you would have a period from 2019, 2020 when not much happened. I think the hopes started to diminish. Not a huge amount happened. You had the climate movement, but politically there was an interregnum, I would say. But there was, in particular, the 2020 general election actually became, in the South, became a real flashpoint of hope. Again, it was posed that, okay, for the first time in the history of the country, you could have a Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael could be out, and you could have had a government without them, a Sinn Féin-led government with the left or whatever. That was posed in people's mind as a real possibility, and there was a real enthusiasm from like the start of that election to the end. Sinn Féin and the left both rose dramatically in the polls, in particular in Sinn Féin, and that desire for change, that mood was interrupted despite Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael clearly not winning that election. They came together afterwards in a coalition and continued the status quo. And I think in some ways that felt like, oh, a prospect of change was blocked. And yeah. And then you had a period when I think Sinn Féin did quite well, even after that, in raising that this election was being stolen, that the people voted for change, and now we're getting the most right-wing government in the history of the state. This isn't what people voted for. That kind of fairly good anti-establishment rhetoric, and they organised rallies around the country along that kind of messaging, which I think was good. But I say when COVID hit, and by the end of 2020, Sinn Féin switched into kind of a Starmer-esque a holding pattern of not saying too much, trying to be 2 weeks ahead of government policy, rather than saying, on COVID, just like trying to say what you think the government is going to say tomorrow, you should say it today, like nothing radical. And in general, kind of like they thought that their goal was to try to show that they were a safe pair of hands, get ready for government kind of thing. And they thought that would suit them well, and they'd sort of ride into government. Unfortunately, that is not what has happened. Actually, with the left not taking to the streets, no big protests about the housing crisis, no big oppositional kind of movements from the left. The far right were able to seize the streets through COVID, but then also more recently in anti-immigrant stuff. And we've had the beginnings of an emergence of a far right here. I won't go in huge details, but this in the recent local and European elections earlier on this year, I think we saw a couple of this play out. One is that the government really decided to double down on the playing the immigration card. So just concretely there's a photo of tents along one of the canals in Dublin City. This was because the government decided to kick people out of refugees out of emergency accommodation, despite the fact that they had enough places. They left places in emergency refugee accommodation empty in order to force people out, give them tents, and then you had these scenes of 30, 40 tents set up along the canal on parklands in the city centre, and that became a daily visual outcry. People were then angry about the tents, and then the council would come in and sweep away the tents and clean up the area, etc., etc. And it meant that it was a daily news cycle during the election. More tents set up, tents cleared. Fascists attack tents. Government condemns the fascists for attacking the tents and says we all have to be reasonable, etc., etc. It allowed the government to, on the one hand, make racism and immigration the key issue of the election, and to present themselves as somehow the in between, the balanced ones, tough on immigration but also tough on the far right kind of a notion. Unfortunately, in that elections, Sinn Féin fell for that switch of making the election primarily around immigration. That's a photo there from a leaflet that they produced where they tried to attack the government from the right on the issue of immigration, saying that their approach has been shambolic. Sinn Féin is opposed to open borders. Ireland must control its borders. And at one stage, they criticised the government for not cutting welfare allowances of Ukrainian refugees in the same way as they were cutting welfare allowances of non-Ukrainian refugees, and they were arguing to cut it all down. And I think, but that didn't work. Like nobody really believed that Sinn Féin were going to be harder on refugees than the government. Do you know what I mean? Like they didn't get the far right vote. They lost some left votes, but most importantly, they allowed the narrative of the election to stick on that. I think, then in the outcome of the elections, the far right did make some gains. I wouldn't overstate it. There's 5, what I would say, outright far right councillors now elected in Ireland. Like far less than there are even revolutionary socialist councillors, never mind broad left councillors. I mean, there is also more of an emboldened far right, though, much beyond that. You'd be cutting yourself if you just looked at the ones that got elected. They did also manage to do very, very well across the board, both explicitly far right, but also the more populist right as well. And then there was also some important gains. I need to move on. Some important gains for the socialist left and some losses as well. The person photoed there is Kay Keane, who's a newly elected councillor in Jobestown, one of the hardest pressed parts of Dublin, but who's been doing community work for a long time, organising community campaigning for small things, for for like playgrounds, for investment in the area, that kind of basic stuff, but building up and that was an area where we were fighting like neck and neck with far right candidates, but we managed to win seats. Interestingly, the far right also won a seat in that area. That's also replicated in another area, Ballymun, another very hard pressed area of Dublin, where both the far right and the Socialist left won seats in the same ward, in the same area, in the same election. It's this kind of polarization that's happening, but I need to move on. The final conclusion part, my big part of the article that I was, the concluding part of the article that I was arguing, is that we need to learn in Ireland from the experiences elsewhere. And in particular, I pointed to France, the coming together of the Nouveau Front Populaire there, and arguing for a similar left front in Ireland in the upcoming general election. So that was two parts that I proposed. This may be over some people's heads. One was a broad left bloc, or vote left, transfer left pact, which is something that People Before Profit had advocated before the elections, for all of the left parties to rule out coalition with Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael, and then instead present a left alternative, say that this election is a choice between the establishment and a left government. That was one, and to stop that drift, stop the drift to the right, stop trying to scapegoat immigrants and feed into their narratives, and instead present a genuine left alternative. And then the other proposal in the article was for within that the socialist left, because there's People for Profit, that has a number of 4 TDs and like I can't remember how many councillors, but a good chunk of councillors. There's Solidarity, another revolutionary or socialist group, which we work together with in the Dáil as a technical group. But there are also a whole plethora of radical left independents engaged in community works, councillors, TDs, and the like, and that share not just a left program, but a much broader socialist program, and that there would be a case of trying to come together in some sort of alliance within that. I pointed to the example of People of Profit Solidarity, which, without getting too technical, they're formally speaking 2 different blocks, but legally they're one list so they stand in the general election as PBP Solidarity, and therefore they can have differences and they have their own structures, etc., but they present as one on the ballot. And I was saying that surely the broader socialist left could do something like that, a left bloc list or a socialist left list. And then the final thing, I just wanted to say something beyond elections. I won't go through this, but like, elections are not the be all and end all whatsoever. You cash in your chips in elections that you have to have won through community campaigning. So there, beyond elections, the ways to fight the far right, I think, is organise. One is we need to organise in communities. We need to build campaigns for the libraries, for the parks, for the whatever the local issues that agitate people, for the challenge rotten landlords, etc. Go in, find the issues, organise campaigns in there. 2, we do need to organise online and in the media to challenge their propaganda. I think that is important. There's great work being done, but we need to do that a lot more to try to highlight who the far right really are and what their agenda is. And 3, I do think we need to be preparing in the south to organise on the streets, to confront them on the streets as well, to take back the streets. But fundamentally, you can only do all of those if you have the bases in the community. Anyway, I will stop there.
Thank you so much, and thank you everyone. It's really informative, and if anyone has any questions, feel free to raise your hand or write something in the chat. I did have a question, especially like where you mentioned you guys went through the notion of, working class being disengaged, weakness of working class organising that we find ourselves within, and the need to sort of campaign and sort of build up that momentum. One thing I've noticed in terms of like sort of struggling is fatalism, which I get it myself. I don't wake up and sort of jump out and like, yeah, we're going to do it, because sometimes I don't think we will. So I was wondering if any of sort of the speakers had any ideas about sort of overcoming fatalism, because when you go on the news, when you look outside and you're like, oh shit, we can't even get the basics here. So yeah, anything on fighting fatalism would be really, really appreciated. Anyone had any ideas?
Just a very quick one. I mean, it's important not just to focus on Ireland or Britain or Europe. I mean, a lot of the work we do is international. We have good international contacts and the work of people in Central and South America in particular mass in Bolivia is a great example of mass movement of political education in communities and villages, and mobilizing that to win and to win power. So you know, we can be overly European focused sometimes, you know, and Anglo and Celto-centric maybe. So it's important to look at the wider world, and the fact that we're a global movement helps sometimes, you know. It's, if you just look at your own street or your own workplace, it can of course become extremely fucking depressive very quickly. So just that global perspective is really important.
I've got some. So I'm not that much Anglo-centric or UK-centric, because my reference primarily is Southern Europe, Greece, Italy, Turkey, the Balkans. So having been through the economic crisis, the local movement, left-wing movements, anarchist movements, and so on, what they did is that they took action. Like, for example, apart from, you know, meeting necessities, they set up housing squad for refugees. They set up classes for children, places for, you know, mental health support, and these things, they're still in there. They also advance their own environmental struggles. Like Greece, out of nowhere, in a span of 5 years, has developed 3-4 from the bottom environmental movements against gold mining, against the expansion of Greek capitalism, and a few days ago, for example, in Athens, 100 people sign up for a firefighting force organized by a small anarchist group called Rubicon, because Greece has money for police force but doesn't have money for firefighters to put down the fires. So everything seems to be going to shit, but the only thing you can do is just take action, and not, and that's probably something. I think in the UK there is the expectation of someone else to take action, like an organization or a charity or a Labour Party, or, you know, where in many other parts of the world this action comes right from the people. Like, you know, 10 people and you come together and you start creating something from the scratch, and you try to expand it as much as you can. So yeah.
Yeah, I think I would be remiss if I didn't say that, look at working class women. Whenever you feel that fatalism, because it's so many examples of working class women around the world who are like feminist led, organizing, whether that's from Latin America, Southeast Asia, where I have my organizing roots. Women Against Pit Closures, one of my personal UK favorites. You know, we talk about really rooted in communities, food, children running around, songs being sung, dances being danced. You know, that's how we beat the fatalism, and part of that fatalism is, like, you know, is actually a ruling class agenda, isn't it? That's exactly how they destroy our communities and our spirit. And let's not let that happen. If our organising and our political projects are rooted really in that kind of care and joyful resistance, and I don't mean that in some kind of add-on decorative way, I mean like in everything we do, then yeah, one of the most beautiful things I saw recently, and I would love to have one, is Mark's Memorial Library on the stairs on the way up, and they have these like decorative plates, and they've got a whole load from the Women Against Pit Closures, and it's just like that's where I draw from when I think about, do I really want to get out of bed to do this? Because they did in the worst of times.
Could I go in there, or just on my own 2 cents on that, on the how to fight the impending, or the anxiety of it all failing and feeling powerless, is I know it sounds a bit weird, but I think it's useful to understand the periods we're going through. That, like, this is tough. This is this is the toughest period of organizing I've experienced. I've been involved in activism for 21 years, but I think I understand why it's tough. There was a brief moment when it looked like the left could go forward and everything would be great and we could knock down boundaries. And do you know what I mean? You could look like in Britain, it looked like you could have Corbyn as prime minister without having to do all the tough work of, you know, community organising and rebuilding fighting trade unions and all of that. It for a while it looked like there was an easy solution. That hope was smashed, and then it's out of when the left drops the ball and the opportunities are missed and hope is smashed. Then there is a space there for the far right, and it becomes a period of I think a period of mild reaction that we're operating in. But that's useful to know for me because it also like. That's laws of history. You know what I mean? The rest of it is also true. Capitalism is continuing to decline, to create crises, to attack working class people, and the same factors that originally forced people into struggle, that they had no choice but to fight back, etc., etc. That will happen, and then the final thing that will happen again. Capitalism is doing that same thing again. Capitalism has no choice but to fight working class people, and that inevitably means working class people at a certain stage reach a breaking point, and they have no choice but to fight back. The final thing that I'd say is like I think we are in a bit of an interregnum. We're between one period of mass struggle and another period of mass class struggle. But the other interregnum that I talk about is just before the 2011 period that I talked about in Ireland. From 2008 to 2011, you had this weird period where there was austerity raining down on people, but there was no real resistance. But at that stage, that was very confusing. I remember trying to go like, things are getting shit. Are people ever going to fight? Maybe people are useless. They're not even. There's no strikes. There's no protests. There's no people who are batting it out. But the conditions that capitalism was enforcing on people was forcing people towards struggle, and that was laying the basis for the big eruptions that we saw in that period. And I think we're going through something similar now. The attacks. Capitalism is getting arrogant and is weighing in with even bigger attacks than they tried before, and I think that's sowing the seeds of the next major class struggles. You know.
Thank you. So I didn't realise I'd unmuted myself. I'm sorry if you could hear me vaping. I was trying to feel my subtle in the background. Yeah, Bryce, you had a question.
Yeah, I just wanted to say thank you so much for all this. This is incredible, and I just wanted to maybe circle back to what Sasha was saying because I really deeply remember when I was in Living Rent and Scotland Students' Union when basically we were taught about like actually the real history of where the roots of housing policy and housing changes in the legislation happened, and that all happened with shipyard workers' wives from Glasgow coming together, and whilst the men were doing building the shipyards, women were coming together, hustling hard in working class communities, and really be able to really bring the social change that is required to then start the foundation of the housing policies and housing changes that we've seen today in Scotland. So I'm really delighted to see that, and I know that there's a lot of work that's going on just now within Living Rent to bring rent controls and stuff like that. I also just wanted just to sing true as well back to another thing which Sasha was saying is about like how do we how do we build an alternative? How do we build an alternative for, and I'd love to hear more about these more alternatives, because one alternative that happened during COVID was basically a really strong woman called Sarah Keeble came together in Fife, where I come from, and they created basically Shield, which is Sarah's Help in Economic Living Difficulties, which spell Shield. And it was basically about trying to get some food and some ready-made meals to people, to the most vulnerable in society, and really building like food sharing and also getting like food in stock and stuff like that, and redistributing ones which were not sold, for example, the co-op, for example, and getting fair share and things like that. And it really worked really well. It wasn't a food bank. It was a community hub, and it was bringing more than just that. It was bringing some incredible things. And I think that the one thing which reminds me of the documentary I was watching about Patriotic Alternative, the far right organising group, was that Sam Melia, who that's his that's is not sure of his real name, but anyway, he was found to have said in a piece about like patriotic alternative goes and targets, and that targets predominantly low socio-economical council estates with people with precarious housing situations, and that's where their breeding ground is, getting these people to basically to stir up, and they then go to these so-called summer gatherings, where it's a family-friendly summer gathering and tries to bring community together. And I'm like, that's just so synonymous, like with the left-wing tactics in which we're using, and how they're like othering that and capitalizing that. So I'm wondering how is there any sort of alternatives at all which we could build to sustainable long-term alternatives of mutual aid, which could really be able to keep people together and to really stop the scourge of the far right using that and capitalizing left-wing tactics to be able to do things, because I'm really open to hearing like solutions to try and be able to maybe implement it in Scotland, because I'm positively terrified. I mean, I literally was so terrified about going out on the 7th of September to that, because we were hearing that they were busing people up from England because they wanted to, because basically that we didn't have the numbers in Scotland, but they're literally trying to get people up to England, up to Scotland to cause riots, and it's terrifying. And there's been doxing going on within Telegram groups, and it's just terrifying. So yeah, thanks.
I think like going back to what Emma said at the beginning for the framework for this event was like looking at democracy and how far right and ruling class agendas break down democracy in order to kind of promote where they are taking us into the next capitalist iterations. And one of the things that we can really look is like through like taking kind of my work in like is community organizing, right? So it's kind of really localized, and then you add the political education on the top, and you have to constantly think, okay, what next? Where's the next thing that we build with people? And so looking at like local economic wealth redistribution, local kind of municipalist projects that we can kind of really root in a socialist agenda. And like, I won't say too much of this because I know Stevie and Trademark do a lot around community wealth building, but like really looking at how we can introduce that at a really local level, like starting from our organizing work. And then when you build in understanding political economy into that, the next kind of line is like, okay, what comes next? Like, how do we actually build that? How do we kind of look at the local government around us and do things that can intervene in that space, as well as building this kind of alternatives. We're not always like waiting for the next election cycle, or we're not waiting for the revolution necessarily. We're kind of like building it and toppling down what is there at the moment. And I will very, very neatly lead Stevie into talking about community wealth building, because I think that is probably the alternative that we're looking for here.
Well, I won't get into it too much detail. It's just one of the important aspects of political education. What you do is you have to give people an idea of hope and the idea of what the future might look like. And we have had a policy for 10 or 15 years, I suppose, in terms of our political education work, but also being very practical in terms of practical approaches to developing left political economy, and that has included our work on cooperatives in Belfast. We established a number of worker co-ops with ex-prisoners on the interface in Belfast over the last 15 years, and that kind of segued into working with other groups in the solidarity economy. Not that we think that creating islands of socialism in a sea of imperialism, capitalism is the future, but creating those structures and those structures in communities that are owned and controlled and benefit local communities is just a different approach than just trade union organizing or community organizing. And it gives power back to communities, and it involves communities in talking about alternatives to capitalism. And that's one of the reasons why we do that practical work, is it gives you the opportunity to talk to people about post-capitalist futures. And I think that's quite crucial too, in terms of hope and in terms of pointing to a different future than just the the drudgery of daily life. So our work on co-ops and solidarity economy and community wealth building and all of that is as much about political education as it is about the genuine, really positive outcomes it has for communities. I mean, just one quick story. When we first set up the first cross-community worker co-op, which was the Belfast Cleaning Society, comprised mostly of ex-prisoners, women ex-prisoners in the conflict, the first profit they made was 10 grand cash from an outdoor gig, and we brought the money into the organisation and put it on the table in front of them. And those women, working class women from both sides of the interface in Belfast, they bought a van with it, and they put a van on the road, and they invested that money in growing their co-op. And it's now it's not a massive co-op. There's about 20 of them. It has a turnover of about £600,000-700,000 a year, and it's the largest worker co-op in Ireland. So that gives people hope. So having something to point to in a working class community is quite useful, So that's what we do.
Does anyone have any other questions or any other thoughts?
Just before, I'm going to have to switch to my mobile, but I can still answer questions then.
Mhm.
But just before, just on a similar vein, but a kind of a different approach to it. I think it's also useful to just try to find wins. I think the left, it can be tough at times. It's lovely when you're fighting the big thing, and we could actually, you got a big mass movement. That's great. Hook it into my veins. Do you know what I mean? But unfortunately, that's not always possible. And then we can sit around and just wait for the next big mass movement, or complain about the fact that there isn't a general strike or whatever. But I think that just breeds demoralization and whatever. I think it might seem, I think it is about trying to find local campaigns, or in your workplace, try to find the local issue. But in particular, I'm more used to community work, trying to find a local issue in an area that you can mobilize people around, that you can get 50 people into a room to discuss the key issue that they have, whether that is that there's not enough special needs places in the local school, or that it's an apartment block and they want to get the lifts fixed, or I know that stuff, when you want to be changing the world, it can seem a little bit. I'm not advocating it from the point of view of charity. If you get one thing done, then you'll feel great and you'll feel like a do-gooder. I'm decidedly not a do-gooder. But I'm advocating it from the point of view of, if you manage to organize people and they see that they got the thing done, not because there was some do-gooder that did it for them, but they came together, they organized, and they won something. That can build power, that can build confidence, that can organize, bring into activity people that didn't necessarily consider themselves lefties or whatever. But that, for you as an organizer, that can also give you good organizing experience as well. I am in favor of linking that to electoral work for socialists where it's possible, without getting electoralist about it, but try to build long-term institutional power as well. But even out of that sort of long-term community organizing, I think it's not the solution. At the end of the day, we're going to need the big mass movements. But if the big mass movements aren't possible, this is a good thing for us to be hammering away at, and preparing and organizing and developing a new layer of leaders to lead the next mass movements.
I have a question. Am I allowed to ask a question?
Yeah.
Speak. I have a question. Actually, something that I've been kind of, I guess, trying to find solutions to, and be really interesting to hear if anyone has got one that's worked. So a lot of the communities that I've been working with work on a really local level, kind of deindustrialized areas, like ex-mining towns. One of them also has like a neo-Nazi mayor. Like there's a kind of like different examples, different towns around Europe. But one thing that I've been really struggling with is trying to get local organizers to see things like in a more internationalist way, and to kind of make the connections internationally when they are so looking at they're kind of meeting their material needs every day and like really surviving and in that kind of everyday struggle. And it's like, yeah, it's not always easy to get people to look at like, okay, well, we're dealing with this kind of just transition and climate justice issue here, and this is what's happening in the other parts of the world, and understanding why that solidarity is important. And it'd be really great to hear any experience that people have on how they've brought this conversation to local communities who are on that journey.
Very quickly, Sasha, just in terms of the work we do in political education to do that, we like there's some, I'm happy to send you the materials. We do a workshop and a session with people, young working class punters, trade unionists for the most part, and we base it on the t-shirt, we base it on the cup of coffee, and we do the classic imperialist analysis of where this t-shirt came from, who's making money out of it, where the value is created, how that's value is created by labor, how labor doesn't get the worth of that value. And you can pick any kind of commodity in any product, and immediately you're in the global south, immediately you're in Bangladesh, immediately you're in West Africa. It works really well. It works really well as well to connect people to the commodities that they surround themselves with in their daily lives, and how it was produced, and the role of labor in producing that. So I'm happy to share that stuff with you, you know, and it's just it's just a way in really to discussing that idea that we live in a, you know, we live on a planet, we're all globally connected, but we're connected by things we shouldn't be connected by, which is commodity creation, you know, and the damage that does to labor and to the planet itself. So it's a useful entrance, you know, just picking up a cup of coffee in a room with a group of punters, or pointing at someone's t-shirt, you know.
Cool, thank you.
I would also chime in the power of storytelling for making those connections, because as I think some organisers struggle because they don't know how to make those connections internationally or outside their community, because, you know, you don't know who you don't know where to find them. And even things like a documentary or like a podcast that's actually going through that experience can kind of it's like a process of I don't know if rehumanization is a word, but you know what I'm trying to say with that. It kind of makes it a bit more real, a bit less abstract. So I'd recommend them documentaries. Like it's really sort of good and powerful way to do it, and especially because there's so many like short ones on YouTube now or wherever, so people don't have to commit to like an hour for something. Sort of, yeah.
To build on that, back home, documentaries were used by both the anti-fascist movement and the environmentalist movements to bring local communities together. Like it was a public screening on a plaza. I think I hear someone from my phone. Sorry, got distracted. And that sparked conversations. And local people then, like the example of Skouries in northern Greece, then they start exchanging ideas with people from Brazil. Like, and you had a small conservative village called Skouries talking with leftist environmentalists in Sao Paulo, and that started from their own localized struggle, but documentaries were used as catalysts to bring connections. So yeah, it's good one.
Thanks.
Also, I had something else in mind. Cian said that you need to celebrate your small wins, and in order to reach that point, what the far right does to celebrate their own win is to try to give they pretend to give power to the working class. Like, I think if you want to combat that, that's what you need to do. You need to give voice to the local working class and organize around local issues. It's one of the best ways to do so. So, for example, in Edinburgh, council housing has a massive problem all over the city with damp, and there are people who are going mental about it because it affects their daily lives. So if you go to Pilton, which is a working class poor neighborhood in Edinburgh, and you start organizing people there around addressing that issue, you're going to empower them, you're going to give them voice, you're going to bring lots of different people together. And this actually has happened in Edinburgh with Living Rent in a different neighborhood. I think it was Cranketini. So if you want to reach that point, you just need to pay attention to what the local working class communities are going through and then trying to intervene, but not necessarily try to lead them, but speak with them so they can take action on their own. So, yeah.
So we'll leave it for there for now, but thank you everyone for coming and sort of the speakers for sharing your thoughts. Our next panel discussion on November the 6th, where we're going to be looking at the representation of the far right in like the media and films. So it'd be great to see you there. But thank you everyone for coming. Have a good evening. And yeah, bye.